in a moment. So I'm going to share my screen. I put together a few slides by way of provocation, and then we'll get into more what the ethos of these salons are, which are conversation and allowing the really uncommon communities that we're able to gather here to contribute to those in this idea space. So I kind of am calling this introduction just a tour through flourishing commons in our civic spaces. And, first of all, just thank you to each of you. You've brought a lot of energy already to these conversations, and that's given us a lot of enthusiasm for them. And so we appreciate that. We appreciate you making some time today, and it's good to see familiar and new faces online. A number of you are some of my favorite thought partners and people that you'll notice have contributed a lot of language to this presentation, this introduction. My words in this introduction will be only a glimpse and will be completely inadequate, as most of these are, especially for ideas as expansive as the ones we're centering today. And they're really meant to be a provocation for a living conversation that's going to take place within these meetings, throughout them, in between them, and in the spaces on the sides of them. And it's really going to be about these ideas of what a knowledge commons is and what role it plays in kind of the flourishing of our society and in the future of our the way that we gather and make sense together. So I'm going to try in this brief introduction to weave together kind of a fabric across some ideas and individuals and times and relate it to some ethos and practices that I hope we can collectively cultivate within these salons. So I'd like to begin with a few words about how we hope we will gather in these salons, where our ethos will be some of the ground rules that we hope will guide our exchanges and will help the network in this community flourish. And maybe it can become a model and some direct experience for each of us about what flourishing is and how it can be created. So I always like to begin my talks with introducing myself a little bit. I like to bring the personal aspect to it, and I hope that others can feel comfortable and welcome to do the same. So I think it's one way to support healthy relationality, which I'll talk about a little bit, is in knowing one another, and not really in sometimes the shallow way that we typically introduce ourselves, but in the ways that help us understand the other people that we meet with, as having worlds as rich and vivid as the ones we have internally as well. So as JD mentioned, I'm an aerospace engineering scientist and a data scientist that's worked in and across NASA and a number of other places, studying the space environment. And so I've kind of studied that in a number of ways. My field has been space physics. So how do we understand the space environment, its impact on our technologies, and our world? And the way that I've kind of approached that is a systems level perspective. So trying to understand everything from how a star generates energy, how that energy is propagated through space, and how it impacts a planetary environment and an atmosphere, and the way that perhaps living organisms respond and interact with that. And so taking that systems level perspective is integrating a lot of different things and trying to understand across a whole systems area. But before I'm a researcher, I'm many things. I am also a brother, son, daughter, and recently in the past 18 months, a new father. And so those are important roles that I play that are separate from the things that I research. And you'll also see and hear today that I'm someone who engages in conversation and thinks about a number of broader perspectives. What are the implications of the way that we do science, how we do science, the history of that, as well as how it integrates into things like art and other cultural areas of society. And then I'm also a host of a podcast called Origins. And this is something that at least one person on this call has been a part of. And I know a number of other of you I've talked with as well. But that's another thing that I do. So in kind of setting the ethos for these events, we wanted to make 3 kind of asks of you and just kind of put these ideas in your mind so that we can shape how we'll discuss and how we'll have civil conversation with one another. The first is something, and I think this is something that Sarah Hendren is language that she used with me originally, and she's online today. But she used the term intellectual friendship, or spirit of intellectual friendship. And I think it's really important that we adopt that spirit, so that we be open and willing to and accepting of all ideas, and making these conversations about exploration and co-creation and kind of being curious together, which I think we'll all agree is such an exciting and exhilarating way to be. And so I think it all begins today with this inaugural event. I also would like to ask that everyone cultivate a spirit of epistemic humility. So kind of questioning and wondering about how it is we know what we know. And so I think that that's a topic that will come up, and I know it's come up in a number of conversations with each of you individually. And then finally, I think this is really an opportunity. So these salons are meant to introduce people to one another, to raise ideas, and we encourage people to self-organize, to build a living conversation, not only within these specific in-person or virtual events, but also outside of these and connecting to one another, whatever medium or forum that you might like to do for that. So I wanted to introduce these ideas, and I wanted to start with this kind of huge concept of flourishing itself. This is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I wanted to kind of cobble together some inadequate thoughts that may describe that and give you some frameworks for starting to think about flourishing. So the first one is kind of going way back to some philosophy in the ancient Greek area. And this is something that we paraphrased from Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. And he kind of describes flourishing as a capacity to play several different roles in the course of a day, the capacity to be something other than a worker in a meaningful way. And this term that kind of remains used regularly, but to be fully expressed. What that means exactly still is open to interpretation and a number of different comments. There are many other ways of thinking about this as well. One I like from James Sussman, who's an anthropologist, talks about it as using our wealth well to enrich ourselves spiritually, enrich ourselves mentally, and doing social good. And I thought that captured a few important dimensions of what flourishing, or how we think about flourishing, might be. Then there's Alain de Botton talks about a capacity to enter imaginatively into the minds of people with whom you don't immediately agree and look for charitable explanations for behavior that doesn't appeal to you. And I know in responding to the survey, a number of you called out ideas like civic imagination. I think that is something that's spoken to by this interpretation of flourishing. There are many of these. We could go on for a very long time in thinking about this, and I'm sure each of you have wonderful resources and words that you could add to this. This is not meant to be comprehensive, but I did want to bring it to two dimensions that are always with me, I think, as I think about this. And that's dimensions that have been defined by Simone de Beauvoir and W.E.B. Du Bois. And Simone de Beauvoir talks about freedom being able to be achieved through the freedom of others. And so that's something that's been really important and impactful for me as well, in thinking about flourishing, about how flourishing is not about per se, it's not about the individual, but it's about building that capacity in relationship to others. And I think it for me calls to mind this famous quote by W.E.B. Du Bois about being coworkers in the kingdom of culture. And so both of those kind of stay with me, and I thought that was important language to bring here. So we use the word flourishing here in these salons because I think it implies a more muscular framework than we're used to talking about. So not one that is necessarily about uninterrupted bliss and progress and getting everything we want immediately, but an acknowledgement of the difficulties in living amongst them. And so I wanted to talk a little more about why a framework of flourishing is important. And that kind of brings me to this idea of the commons. And so I realized that may be an unfamiliar idea to some, and so I wanted to briefly introduce that. This really began, the idea of the commons began as a study of spaces that we share together. And this began with natural resource spaces, such as fisheries, forests, farming land, agriculture, and in studying how it is that we use those territories. So back in 1968, Garrett Hardin who kind of was responding to some research into how we use common spaces, published a very famous article called The Tragedy of the Commons. And he's described this concept of a tragedy where the kind of greed of people using these spaces leads to the depletion of those resources, and that being the destiny of all common spaces. And so that's been a concept that we've kind of followed, whether subconsciously or not, in thinking about how we organize common spaces. But back in the kind of early 90s, there's been this seminal work that eventually earned Elinor Ostrom a Nobel Prize about kind of disrupting this idea, or kind of overcoming the idea of the destiny of commons being one of depletion of the resource, of diminishing that resource. And I think it kind of eclipsed the idea of commons being doomed to deteriorate, and kind of exposed it as a myth. I think what it raises is that a more appropriate title for this tragedy of the commons paper would be the tragedy of unregulated resources. And so what she did was help us understand that there are solutions to commons problems that did not require state intervention or corporation, that there are robust self-organized governance regimes that led to flourishing common spaces. And so the question that we've been asking since, and continue to ask, is how do we govern commons? And how do we bring about the flourishing of common spaces? And so this has been thought of in the natural resource area, but more recently, our common spaces have changed drastically, and they continue to change drastically to now to include things like information commons, digital commons, and what we've been talking about capaciously as the knowledge commons. And so how do we understand how to bring the concept of the commons much more widely to things like how we share knowledge, how we communicate, how do we gather? And these can be vitally important common spaces. And I think they're kind of frontiers of thinking that we need to be trying to understand. And so research into knowledge as a commons kind of remains, I think, in its infancy, relatively, especially to other sciences. And it must contend with a rapidly changing knowledge sphere in our society. But it originally emerged to allow for the integration of study areas that have been traditionally segregated, which I think is certainly the motivation for these salons as well. And the areas that these have at least started to focus on have been intellectual property rights, computer codes and infrastructure, academic libraries, invention and creativity, open source software, collaborative science, and then getting to things like citizenship and democratic processes and collective action. So you can see it touches a lot of different areas, this as a research field. But the connection between information and its various forms and commons and its various forms has caught the attention of a wide range of scholars, artists, and activists. And I think you'll notice just by looking around the room here today that that is certainly the case. And I hope you'll take a moment to meet the people around you, because it's such a fantastic group here gathered. And I'm really excited to be in conversation about these things. So with these ideas about the commons in mind, I want to go through kind of a progression of thoughts, connections, and bring in elements that we'll be discussing in these salons. And so that progression begins with the relationship between flourishing and democracy. And I really love this quote by Danielle Allen, and it's in this fantastic collection of essays called Difference Without Domination. If you haven't read it or been aware of it, it's a really excellent collection. But they talk about democracy is necessary for human flourishing, that people need the tools of a healthy democracy so that they can craft their own lives and contribute to the crafting of their community. It gives them a means of empowerment, and empowerment is core to human flourishing. And so I think this kind of very explicitly, very clearly makes the connection between our own flourishing and democracy, and something that I wanted to bring there. The second progression of the idea here is the relationship between democracy and our cultural stories. And for this, I wanted to point to an article that Jonathan Haidt recently published in The Atlantic called Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid. So pretty provocative title. But the item that I wanted to pull out there was that he writes that there's three major forces that collectively bind together successful democracies. So that's social capital, and that's kind of extensive social networks with high levels of trust, which is a topic we'll certainly be discussing. Strong institutions, and I know that a number of you have commented on this kind of ambiguous term, strong there, and how we can maybe unpack that and unravel that a little bit more, and shared stories. And so these are things that kind of point to the dimensions that we may be discussing during these salons. And then finally, I wanted to talk about, and I think is invoked by Jonathan's words, is where we create and tell our stories being critically important. And for this, something that's always on my mind is kind of this media theory approach, made popular by researchers such as Marshall McLuhan. He wrote famously about the medium being the message. So societies have always been shaped more by the nature of the media by which people communicate than by the content of that communication. And so I think that this kind of sheds light on what are the stories we're telling, but also where are we telling those stories and in what ways? And so that's very important to me as well. And so I want to bring this back to the Knowledge Commons, about how we're thinking about it, and offer you a definition that we've used for this. And this is something I wrote about and published last year, but we kind of think of Knowledge Commons as a combination of intelligent information representation, and then the openness, governance, and trust required to create a participatory ecosystem whereby everyone in that community maintains and evolves this shared information space. And so there are kind of a couple of components of this that I maybe wanted to pull out briefly. But in terms of intelligent information representation, I think this kind of goes to how important the words we use are. So Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote famously, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." And so the language that you have kind of define what you're able to kind of think about. And then there's this wonderful initiative from the On Being Foundation called the Civil Conversations Project. And one of the phrases they use in that project extensively is "words make worlds." And I think that's true in a number of contexts, and just sheds light on the importance of the words that we use and ultimately building the stories that we tell. But it is also about how we create these new worlds, whose voices are a part of that. And this is the deliberative civic part of our discussion. And then I wanted to pull out this participatory ecosystem component. I think it kind of brings to light for me two concepts and I guess movements that are important to raise. And I think there's a new metaphor that Jean-Paul Lederach has established where it's moving kind of from a critical mass, which we often think about as being important, to more of a critical yeast. And so he talks about the place where the critical mass and the critical yeast meet in relevance to social change is not in the number of people involved, but rather in creating the quality of the platform that makes this growth strong and possible, and then finding ways to sustain that. And then there's Adrienne Maree Brown's emergent strategy, which is finding visions and plans that embrace complexity, interdependence, and transformation. And I think that's absolutely invoked in the idea of a knowledge commons as well. And I know a number of you are involved in some efforts that I'm going to talk about here just very briefly, but that I think are inherently related to the knowledge commons. So the first is open science. And so this is an effort within the scientific community to make research more accessible, more reproducible, and more inclusive. And there's a lot of definitions about this. This is something that's kind of a tumultuous in terms of a lot of definitions opening up right now. But the one that I think captures some of the elements that are very important in this is that open science is transparent and accessible knowledge that is shared and developed through collaborative networks. And so I just kind of pulled out the two dimensions of that definition and related them back. And I think together they form that knowledge commons that we're talking about. But then actually, very specifically in terms of the future of social media, some of our online gathering spaces and its relationship to democracy, Danielle Allen writes that we must subsidize innovation to reinvent the public functions that social media has displaced, replenish news deserts, and connect it to an alternative form of connection, civic connection, and collaboration, and to consume news together in this term that I really love called healthy relationality. And I think together these also talk about a knowledge commons. And so I want to open this up to discussion, and I want to share about how we've been doing this over the past few years. And it relates to kind of the origin story for these Wonder Workshops. But back at the very beginning of the pandemic, a few of us had been gathering for a while to discuss how do we have these open conversations where flourishing is really kind of a focus, where it kind of builds to that ideal. And we had been talking about support to make these in-person events. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and everything moved virtual and kind of changed what we were doing, how we were thinking about this. And we just decided that we were going to do this online. We were just going to go ahead and get started doing this. And so those gatherings have happened over the previous 3 years, and they've been really fantastic and have formed kind of a foundation for how we've been thinking about these Wonder Workshops, where these have been supported by the cultural programs of the National Academy of Sciences, as well as a number of other efforts, such as Intersections 2021, which Alana and JD can share about. But these have kind of progressed into that. But all of these conversations have been animated by the belief that these liminal spaces are the ones that we need to go to. and they require new sensibilities that must emerge from enhanced plurality of thought. And so we've been trying to, over these conversations, cultivate that idea, that sensibility for a plurality of thought through these salons interactions. And we use the term salon for its historical position as a seat of cultural hubs and actuators of cultural and intellectual development. And so that's what we hope that these will continue to be. So finally, I just want to talk very briefly about what we're here to do. So we've put these forward, and I want to just reiterate that these are very much just suggestions. We hope that the conversation will be driven by your curiosities and your passions. But we want to understand what flourishing is, what it looks and feels like, and how do we recognize and create it. There's a kind of this idea of re-mythologizing America. How do we tell the story of America in different ways, and in our common spaces, our digital spaces? And that relates to how do we make sense together? How do we come up with these new stories that can help our entire community flourish? And then we want to understand, I think this is kind of an interesting perspective from looking at a community as a network. And how can you actually study that to understand what are the characteristics of a flourishing network or graph or social situation. And then we also want to create new ideas, new stories that we can tell that they may alter our lives and society as well. So I mentioned this in the vision document that I've shared with everyone, but this can be a collective scratch space for the exploration of many different ideas, the big ideas. And I think that this community is capable of speaking to, and I've just listed a few that we're thinking about with this, but I encourage you to help us rethink these as well. And then finally, I want to bring it back to the idea of kind of how we do this. So these are big ideas, and they can be difficult to kind of get a handle on. They can be difficult to talk about because they do border on some areas that are tense or uncomfortable. But I think that's important. So Parker Palmer writes about how we hold difference and tension in a life-giving way. And so I hope that we can do that in these conversations. But it begins with just starting to talk and introducing ourselves, introducing ideas that animate us, that have brought us to these conversations, and starting to share ideas. But part of that kind of right of being able to speak and share ideas is kind of the responsibility to listen generously and generatively. So that's absolutely important to how we'll be doing this. And then we also want to explore many ideas, be open to move between those divergent and convergent ways of thinking. And then really this is going to be driven by your inspiration and what you're interested in. So we encourage you to share that, whether you're comfortable sharing it in person on these virtual events or in the notes in other ways as well. So there's many ways to engage with this. But then just kind of in closing and bringing it to opening it to discussion, I always like to place emphasis on the long view of time because it's not always that we'll see immediate results or changes, but there's this line that Rebecca Solnit writes that actions ripple far beyond their immediate objective. And remembering this is reason to live by principle and act in the hope that what you do matters, even when results are unlikely to be immediate or obvious. And I think that helps place focus on kind of this broader perspective, keeping open our minds for this long-term change. So what I wanted to do is kind of go to maybe letting each of you introduce yourselves and offer up the things that are inspiring you. So I wanted to jump to a question, and there's a lot of people online right now, so it may be difficult to go individually through everyone. But what I'll do is I'll open up this question to ask people, how would you begin to describe what it is you're interested in discussing in these salons, and what brought you here, perhaps? And so with that, I'm gonna pause, and I'm gonna open it up generally for anyone who would like to kind of step in and maybe share who they are and what brought you here, what you're animated by.